Have you ever wondered what it truly means to be happy? Not the kind of happiness that comes from wealth, power, or fame. Those things fade, but a deeper, lasting joy that nothing in this world can take away. 2,000 years ago on a mountainside, Jesus revealed a secret, one that has transformed millions of lives. His words weren't just teachings. They were a roadmap to a real, fulfilling life. Today, we're going to explore the 8 Beatitudes, timeless principles that hold the key to true peace, meaning, and lasting joy in our lives. The Sermon on the Mount is not just another speech. It is the foundation of an entirely different kind of kingdom. Unlike earthly kingdoms built on power, conquest, and ambition, this kingdom is established on humility, love, and self-sacrifice. Jesus wasn't just offering advice, he was inviting people into a radical new way of life, one that is countercultural, transformative, and deeply rewarding. Think about it. Our world constantly tells us that success means climbing higher, having more, and being stronger than others. But Jesus flips that thinking upside down. His words call us to something deeper, a life rooted in faith, compassion, and seeking God above all else. If the world's version of happiness has ever left you feeling empty, then these teachings are exactly what you need. Join me as we explore each beatitude and discover how they can truly reshape the way we live today. We live in a world that constantly tells us that success is measured by wealth, power, and influence. But have you ever noticed that even the richest, most successful people often still feel unfulfilled? Jesus introduced a radical idea, one that turns everything upside down. He said that the truly blessed ones are not the powerful, but the humble. Not the rich, but those who recognize their spiritual need. Not the self-sufficient, but those who rely on God. Think about it. Have you ever chased something thinking it would make you happy, only to realize it didn't? Jesus teaches us that true fulfillment doesn't come from what we have, but from who we are in God's kingdom. The Beatitudes aren't just poetic sayings. They are a guide to a life of meaning, purpose, and joy. Are you ready to discover what it truly means to be blessed? Let's dive in together. First, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What did Jesus mean by that? In today's world, being poor is often associated with lack of money, lack of resources, or lack of influence. But Jesus was talking about a different kind of poverty. Being poor in spirit means recognizing our deep need for God. It's the opposite of arrogance or self-sufficiency. It means admitting that on our own we are spiritually bankrupt. Think about this. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt completely lost, like you had no control over what was happening? That feeling of helplessness, of realizing you can't do it alone, that's the beginning of spiritual poverty. It's not about having nothing. It's about realizing that without God, we have nothing. And here's the beautiful promise. When we acknowledge our dependence on Him, He offers us something far greater than anything this world can provide: the kingdom of heaven. Let's take a biblical example. Remember the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee in Luke 18:9-14. The Pharisee stood proudly in the temple, listing off all the ways he was righteous, fasting, tithing, and doing all the right things. Meanwhile, the tax collector, despised by society, stood at a distance, unable to even lift his eyes to heaven. He beat his chest and simply said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." And Jesus made it clear, it was the tax collector, not the Pharisee, who went home justified before God. Why? Because he was poor in spirit. He recognized his need for grace. Now, let's bring this into our everyday lives. How often do we rely on our own strength, thinking we can handle everything? Society tells us to be independent, to hustle, and to make things happen on our own. But Jesus teaches something radical. True blessing comes when we let go of self-reliance and acknowledge our need for Him. The moment we surrender is the moment we truly gain everything. Look at history. Some of the most influential spiritual leaders lived with this kind of humility. Mother Teresa, despite dedicating her life to serving the poor, often spoke about her own spiritual poverty and her need for God's grace. The Apostle Paul, once a persecutor of Christians, wrote in 2 Corinthians 12:9, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." The world tells us strength is about power, but Jesus tells us real strength is found in recognizing our weakness and relying on God. So what does this mean for you? It means that no matter who you are, where you've been, or what mistakes you've made, God's kingdom is available to you. The first step is humility, acknowledging that you need Him, and in return He offers you something far greater than anything this world can offer, eternal life in His kingdom. That's a promise worth holding on to. Second, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. At first this sounds paradoxical. How can mourning, something we naturally try to avoid, be a blessing? But Jesus wasn't talking about shallow sorrow. He was speaking of a deep mourning that leads to transformation, mourning over personal loss, injustice, over sin. It's the kind of grief that doesn't leave us in despair but drives us to God, where real comfort is found. Think about it. When have you felt the most vulnerable, the most broken? Maybe it was losing a loved one, experiencing betrayal, or facing deep regret over past mistakes. That pain can feel overwhelming, like a weight too heavy to carry. But here's the hope. God sees every tear. He doesn't dismiss our sorrow. Instead, He steps into it, offering peace that the world cannot give. Consider Jesus Himself. He wept at the tomb of Lazarus not because He lacked the power to raise him, but because He deeply felt the sorrow of those mourning. John 11:35. His heart breaks over suffering. Likewise, the prophet Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet because he grieved over Israel's sins and the destruction that followed. Jeremiah 9 verses 1. True mourning is not just about sadness. It's about recognizing the brokenness of this world and longing for God to restore it. Now, how does this apply to us? There's a difference between worldly sorrow and godly sorrow. Worldly sorrow leads to despair, but godly sorrow leads to repentance and change. 2 Corinthians 7:10. When we mourn over sin, our own and the world's, for God to work, it's in our mourning that we experience His deepest comfort. Think about how many people try to numb their pain through distractions, substances, or success, only to find the emptiness remains. But Jesus invites us to bring our mourning to Him. The Holy Spirit, also called the Comforter, John 14:16, is God's answer to our sorrow. He brings healing to the brokenhearted and strength to the weary. This isn't just about personal grief, it's also about mourning for others. Do we grieve over the injustices in the world, over the suffering of those around us? Jesus calls us to not just mourn, but to act, comforting others with the same comfort we've received. 2 Corinthians 1:04-4. So what does this mean for you? It means that your sorrow is not wasted. Every tear, every ache of your heart is seen by God, and He promises this. You will be comforted, not always in the way we expect, but always in the way we need. His comfort isn't temporary, it's eternal. One day He will wipe away every tear and mourning will be no more. Revelation 21 verse 4. Until then, we hold on to His promise, trusting that even in our deepest pain we are never alone. Third, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. At first glance, meekness might seem like a weakness. In today's world, we often associate success with power, ambition, and assertiveness. But Jesus teaches the opposite. True strength comes from humility, self-control, and trust in God rather than our own ability to dominate or control others. Think about Moses. He was described as the meekest man on earth, Numbers 12:03. Yet he boldly stood before Pharaoh and led the Israelites out of slavery. His strength was not in overpowering others, but in submitting to God's authority and following His will. Meekness is not about being passive or letting people walk all over you. It's about choosing to respond with patience and grace, even in difficult situations. Jesus Himself is the ultimate example of meekness. He had all power, Yet he humbled himself, washing the feet of his disciples. John 13, verse 5. When he was falsely accused and beaten, he did not retaliate. Instead, he entrusted himself to God. 1 Peter 2:23. This kind of meekness is not weakness. It is power under control, the ability to remain steady in the face of trials without becoming bitter or vengeful. Now let's apply this to our daily lives. How often do we feel the need to prove ourselves, to push ahead, to fight for recognition? Society tells us to be aggressive and to take what we deserve, but Jesus calls us differently. To trust God's timing, to practice patience, to show kindness even when it's undeserved. When we do this, we reflect Christ's character and demonstrate a truly strong faith. The promise in this beatitude is incredible. They shall inherit the earth. What does that mean? It's not just about future rewards in heaven, but about experiencing God's peace and blessings here and now. Those who are meek are not striving and restless. They have a quiet confidence that God is in control. They don't have to grasp power because they know that ultimately God is the one who provides. So what can you do today to practice meekness? Maybe it's holding back an angry response, choosing to forgive instead of seeking revenge, or trusting God when things don't go your way. Meekness isn't something that comes naturally. It's something we grow into as we walk closer to Christ. And as we do, we experience the incredible peace and security that comes from knowing God is in control. Look at history. Many of the greatest leaders were not those who ruled with an iron fist, but those who led with humility. Martin Luther King Jr. fought for justice with courage and gentleness, refusing to repay hatred with hatred. Nelson Mandela, after decades of imprisonment, chose reconciliation over revenge. This is the kind of meekness that changes the world. Strength guided by wisdom, patience, and trust in something greater than ourselves. The world may not always reward meekness, but God does. He lifts those who humble themselves. James 4:10. If we embrace this mindset, we will experience a joy and fulfillment that no earthly power can provide. True strength isn't in control, it's in surrender. Fourth, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. What does it mean to truly hunger and thirst for righteousness? Think about it. When you're physically hungry, it consumes your thoughts. You can't focus on anything else until you've satisfied that craving. Jesus is saying that we should pursue righteousness with the same intensity, the same longing, the same desperation. But let's be honest, what do most of us hunger and thirst for? Success, comfort, approval. The world tells us to chase after wealth and recognition, but Jesus calls us to something deeper. He calls us to crave God's righteousness, His truth, His justice, His holiness. It's not just about personal morality, it's about longing for God's kingdom to be revealed in the world around us. Look at history. Think of people like Martin Luther King Jr., who fought for justice despite persecution, or Mother Teresa, who dedicated her life to serving the poor. They didn't just like righteousness, they hungered for it, they lived it. And in doing so, they changed the world. That's the kind of hunger Jesus is talking about. The Bible is filled with examples of people who sought God with everything they had. David in Psalm 42:1 wrote, "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God." That's not casual interest. That's a deep longing. Daniel prayed faithfully despite threats of death. The early Christians endured persecution because they valued God's truth more than their comfort. So what about us? Do we truly desire righteousness, or do we just settle for convenience? Do we crave justice, or do we turn a blind eye when it costs us something? Hungering for righteousness means standing up for truth, even when it's unpopular. It means choosing integrity when no one is watching. It means seeking God in every part of our lives, not just on Sundays. The promise in this beatitude is profound. They shall be satisfied. The world offers temporary fulfillment, success, pleasure, achievements, but none of it lasts. Only God can truly satisfy the deepest needs of our hearts. And when we pursue Him, He fills us in ways we never imagined. So ask yourself today, what am I truly hungry for? Because whatever we hunger for the most is what we will chase after. If we seek God with all our hearts, we will find Him, and in Him we will be fully satisfied. Maybe you've been searching for fulfillment in the wrong places, relationships, achievements, or material success. But Jesus is inviting us to something greater. He is inviting us to a life where our deepest needs are met, not by the things of this world, but by God Himself. True satisfaction isn't found in what we accumulate, but in who we become when we seek His righteousness above all else. Fifth, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. In a world that often values power over compassion, this beatitude stands as a powerful reminder of what truly matters in God's kingdom. Mercy isn't just about feeling sorry for someone. It's about taking action. It's about stepping into someone's pain and extending grace, even when they don't deserve it. Think about the story of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10:25-37. A man is beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. Two religious leaders walk by, ignoring him. But then a Samaritan, a man from a group despised by the Jews, stops, cares for him, and ensures his recovery. That's mercy. It's not just a feeling, it's an action that changes lives. Jesus Himself embodied perfect mercy. Time and again He extended grace to the outcasts, tax collectors, lepers, prostitutes. He forgave those who crucified Him, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. That is radical mercy. But here's the challenge. Mercy is not always easy. What about when someone hurts us, betrays us? The natural response is to seek justice, maybe even revenge. But Jesus calls us to something higher. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Luke chapter 6:37. When we show mercy, we open the door to receiving mercy in return. Look at history. Nelson Mandela, after spending 27 years in prison, chose forgiveness over bitterness. Instead of seeking revenge, he worked toward reconciliation. His mercy changed the course of a nation. Mercy is powerful. It heals wounds, restores relationships, and reflects the very heart of God. But let's bring this closer to home. Think about your own life. Is there someone you need to show mercy to? Maybe it's a friend who let you down, a coworker who wronged you, or even yourself. Mercy isn't about excusing wrongdoing. It's about releasing bitterness and choosing grace. And here's the promise. They shall receive mercy. When we extend mercy, we align our hearts with God's. We experience the deep joy of forgiveness, and we find freedom from the burden of resentment. So, how can you live this out? Start small. Be patient with the difficult coworker. Offer kindness to someone who's struggling. Forgive that person who hurt you, even if they don't ask for it. Every act of mercy, no matter how small, brings us closer to the heart of God. Mercy isn't weakness, it's strength under control. And in the end, those who show mercy will experience the incredible, life-changing mercy of God Himself. Think of a moment in your life when you received mercy. Maybe someone forgave you when you didn't deserve it. Maybe a friend showed you kindness in a time of need. That's the beauty of mercy. It creates ripples. When we receive mercy, we are called to pass it on. Imagine a world where mercy, not judgment, was our first instinct. That's the kind of world Jesus calls us to build. Sixth, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. What does it mean to be pure in heart? We live in a world that constantly competes for our attention. Our minds are pulled in 1,000 directions, and our hearts are distracted by material success, status, and even social approval. But Jesus tells us that those who have a pure heart, those whose hearts are undivided, wholly devoted to God, will see Him. Imagine looking through a dirty window. No matter how beautiful the view is outside, you won't be able to see clearly. Purity of heart is like cleaning that window so we can fully experience God's presence. It's not about perfection, it's about focus. A pure heart seeks God above all else, not out of obligation, but out of love. Take King David as an example. Despite his failures, he longed for purity. In Psalm 51:10, he cried out, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." He knew that true transformation starts from within. Likewise, Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for their outward religious actions, while their hearts remained corrupt. Matthew 23:27. God isn't impressed by appearances. He looks at the heart. So how do we cultivate purity of heart? It starts with surrender. We need to examine our priorities. What do we desire most? Are we seeking God's will or our own? Purity isn't about following a list of rules. It's about developing a heart that truly longs for God's presence. Purity also requires intentional choices. Think about the things we consume daily, what we watch, listen to, and engage with. Do they draw us closer to God or pull us away? In today's digital world where distractions are everywhere, guarding our hearts is more important than ever. Proverbs 4:23 reminds us, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." The promise in this beatitude is breathtaking. They shall see God. This isn't just about a future reward in heaven, it's about experiencing God's presence here and now. When our hearts are undivided, we begin to recognize His hand in our daily lives, hear His voice more clearly, and walk in deeper intimacy with Him. So ask yourself, what is clouding your heart? What distractions or impurities are keeping you from fully seeing God? Take time today to refocus, to cleanse your heart through prayer, and to seek Him with all that you are, because when you do, He promises, you will see Him. Maybe you've struggled with doubt, with feeling distant from God. That's okay. God isn't looking for perfection, He's looking for sincerity. He wants hearts that are fully His. When we let go of the things that pull us away from Him, we make space for something better, a deep, unshakable relationship with our Creator. And that is the greatest blessing of all. Seventh, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. In a world filled with division, conflict, and anger, these words of Jesus challenge us to live differently. Being a peacemaker isn't just about avoiding conflict, it's about actively working toward reconciliation, bringing people together and reflecting God's love in a broken world. Think about it. When was the last time you saw true peace? Not just silence or the absence of fighting, but real, lasting peace. The kind that restores relationships, heals wounds, and transforms communities. Jesus calls us to be peacemakers because peace is at the heart of God's kingdom. He is called the Prince of Peace, Isaiah 9:20. And His mission was to reconcile humanity to God, Colossians 1:20. But let's be real. Peacemaking is hard. It means stepping into messy situations. It means choosing forgiveness over resentment. It means listening when we'd rather argue, and it's not always appreciated. Look at Martin Luther King Jr. He preached peace in the face of violence. Nelson Mandela chose reconciliation over revenge. They paid a price for their commitment to peace, yet their impact changed the world. Biblically, the greatest example of a peacemaker is Jesus Himself. He didn't just talk about peace, He lived it. He forgave those who betrayed Him. He healed the brokenhearted, and ultimately, He gave His life to bring peace between humanity and God. That's the kind of peace that changes everything. So what does this mean for us today? It means being intentional about bringing peace into our daily lives. It might be something as simple as resolving a conflict with a friend, choosing to be patient in a tense situation, or standing up for someone who is being treated unfairly. It means being the person who bridges gaps rather than builds walls. The promise in this beatitude is powerful. They shall be called children of God. Why? Because when we make peace, we reflect the very heart of our Heavenly Father. We show the world what His love looks like. We become His representatives in a world desperately in need of healing. So here's the challenge. How can you be a peacemaker today? Maybe it's mending a broken relationship, offering an apology, or speaking words of encouragement instead of criticism. Maybe it's standing for justice in a way that brings healing rather than division. Whatever it is, know this: when you choose peace, you are walking in the footsteps of Jesus, and there is no greater calling than that. Imagine a world where more people chose peace over pride, reconciliation over revenge. That's the world Jesus envisioned, and it starts with us. Every time we extend grace, choose understanding over judgment, or seek to unite rather than divide, we bring a glimpse of God's kingdom into our world. So let's be peacemakers, not just in words, but in action. Eighth, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. At first glance, this might be the most difficult beatitude to embrace. Who wants to be persecuted? Who wants to suffer for their beliefs? But Jesus wasn't speaking to people who lived comfortable, easy lives. He was speaking to those who knew what it meant to suffer for standing firm in their faith. Think about it. Throughout history, those who have truly followed God have faced opposition. From the prophets of the Old Testament to the early Christians, standing up for truth often came at a great cost. Take Daniel, for example. He refused to stop praying to God even when it meant being thrown into the lion's den. Or Stephen, the first Christian martyr, who boldly proclaimed the gospel even as he was being stoned to death. Jesus himself was the ultimate example. He was mocked, beaten, and crucified not because he did anything wrong, but because he stood for truth. He warned his followers that they too would face opposition. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. John chapter 15. But here's the key. Persecution is not a sign that we've failed. It's often a sign that we are walking faithfully with Christ. When we choose righteousness over compromise, truth over convenience, we will face resistance. It might not always be physical suffering. Sometimes persecution comes in the form of rejection, criticism, or being misunderstood. Look at the world today. In some places, believers risk their lives for their faith. In others, Christians are ridiculed for standing up for biblical values. Maybe you've experienced this in your own life, choosing integrity at work and being overlooked for a promotion, refusing to conform to the world's standards and being criticized by friends or family. But here's the promise. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is saying that those who endure persecution for His sake will inherit something far greater than anything this world can offer. The kingdom of heaven belongs to them, both now in the peace and presence of God, and in eternity, where all suffering will be wiped away. So what does this mean for us? It means we don't back down when things get hard. We don't compromise truth for acceptance. We hold on to our faith, knowing that we are not alone. If you have ever felt discouraged because of opposition, remember this: your faithfulness is not in vain. The struggles you face for Christ are seen by God, and He promises that His reward is greater than any suffering we endure. Stand firm. Keep trusting. Because in the end, it is not the world's approval that matters, it is God's. The Sermon on the Mount isn't just a lesson, it's a challenge. Jesus didn't simply call people to listen, He called them to live differently. These Beatitudes aren't just comforting words, they're a radical way of life. They flip the world's values upside down. The world tells us power brings success, but Jesus says the meek will inherit the earth. The world chases comfort, yet Jesus says, those who mourn will be comforted. This is the heart of God's kingdom. The question is, will we live by these truths or just admire them from a distance? Are you ready to take that step of faith? We've journeyed through the Beatitudes, uncovering the deep wisdom in Jesus' words. But knowledge alone isn't enough. The real challenge is living them out. The world tells us happiness comes from wealth, power, and self-interest. But Jesus calls us to a higher way, one of humility, mercy, and peace. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. Imagine what your life would look like if you fully embraced these principles. Imagine the peace, the fulfillment, the closeness to God. This isn't just an idea, it's an invitation. Will you step forward and live the way Jesus taught? The choice is yours. If this message has spoken to your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Let others experience the power of Jesus' words. Hit the like button, subscribe for more teachings, and leave a comment below. Which beatitude resonated with you the most? How do you plan to live it out? Let's build a community where we encourage and uplift each other in faith. Remember, true joy is found in walking in God's ways. Let's walk this journey together.